Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Secure Community Network on the NSGP and Grant Application Workshop. Grateful to everyone for joining us today for this conversation and looking forward to what will hopefully be a productive and informative conversation over the next hour or so. A few notes on today's webinar. It is a webinar hosted on Zoom platform, so all of our attendees are muted and off video, but you are welcome to put any questions into the Q&A, and we'll work to address as many as we can over the course of the webinar. Additionally, this is being recorded, and we'll make the recording as well as all mentioned resources available following the conclusion of the webinar. With that, I will turn the conversation over to SCN National Director and CEO, Michael Masters.
Thank you, Dina. I'd like to thank Dina for all of her hard work to get the webinar up and running, as well as our team who compiles the resources along with JFNA and our good partner, Rob Goldberg, working under Alana Brightman to make these resources available to our whole community. Just for clarity, our webinar from January 14th, we will be releasing the materials from that shortly for everybody. Dina will cover that at the back end of the webinar. We didn't want to confuse anybody with the invitation today. SCN, or the Secure Community Network, is the official safety and security organization for the Jewish community in North America, is honored to co-host this webinar with our partner, the Jewish Federations of North America, or JFNA. I think it's no understatement to note that one of the greatest strengths of our community is its diversity, whether it is where we are located, our affiliation, the organizations that we belong to, and that gives us strength. But when it comes to security, we have to take a different approach. A comprehensive, consistent, best practice one, not a siloed one. For one of our other strengths is that we are most successful, we are most strong as a community when we come together as a collective. For over 3,000 years, this has been the case. And in security, coordination is not a condition of success, it's a requirement for it. And we know that every community and institution, regardless of its size, affiliation, or location, should be safe and secure. Whether you're in a community with 250 or 2,000 organizations, or where you're in a community where yours may be the only Jewish organization. Between federations, national organizations, our partners at JFNA, and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, our community is working more closely now than ever before to address the intertwined issues of hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, safety, and security. This is critical. In 2017, less than 8% of Jewish communities had a dedicated security director or professional. Today, more than 65% of communities have access to a professional security resource. We're seeing increased investments and a push to ensure a best practice approach. You're going to hear from several of the individuals that are working in federations and communities around the country today who provide that professional security resource. Robert Graves, Regional Security Advisor for the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, Zach Williams, the Deputy Director for the Jewish Federation of Atlanta, and Chris Usher, the Deputy Director for the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. While we're making progress from these gentlemen and their colleagues around the country and nationally, we have a lot more work to do and more investments to make. It's critical that we do so. We all know the threats facing our community. According to the FBI, over 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes were directed at the Jewish community in 2019, a 14% increase from the year before. And while COVID-19 continues to impact many of our facilities, we know that we live in a heightened threat environment, and that's going to present unique challenges, not just for today, but as our institutions open. So as we open our facilities and communities, we have to be more committed to safety and security. For 16 years, our system has worked to highlight this threat. It has been recognized by law enforcement, DHS, and Congress. Through the work led by the Jewish Federations of North America, the nonprofit security grant program was created. It is a recognition of the threat facing the faith-based community and our community specifically. And thanks to the advocacy and leadership of our community, led by JFNA, supported by SCN and other partners like the OU, we have watched the program grow. This year, it will double to $180 million. We need to take advantage of that recognition to protect and secure our communities. NSGP funding is now protecting more communities and more places. Thanks to our collaborative work, recent changes allow organizations in non-urban areas to take advantage of the program. From attacks in Kansas to Poway, California, as the threat has changed, this has been an important expansion. And today, NSGP funds now can be used to support not just physical security and target hardening measures, but planning, exercise, and training for everyday community members. For organizations that couldn't afford such training in the past, this can literally be the difference between life and death. When you apply, please consider not just physical security enhancements, but including those funds for vital planning and training. It's our goal that every Jewish organization is informed, positioned, and able to apply for and use these funds in an efficient and effective manner. SCN and JFNA, in coordination with local federations, communities, and national partners, are working together to increase our support to communities and organizations, from increased webinars to more resources. SCN has an updated assessment form that organizations can complete on their own. We also have an updated services guide that can assist organizations in applying for money on how to support best practice training and exercises. These resources are on our website and will be continually updated. We'll also be dedicating personnel, additional time, and energy to supporting the community through the process. Please note that we anticipate that the grant will be announced in mid to late February. Historically, it will close 6 to 8 weeks later, but this doesn't mean you should only take 6 weeks to complete the application. We should be working on these applications all year long, but if you haven't started yet, start doing it today. NSGP funding has made our community more safe and secure. It's placed electronic locks on exterior doors of JCCs, panic buttons in school classrooms, and providing training in synagogues. But it can only do this if we take advantage of the opportunity. We know that our way of life in the United States is under attack. So let's work together to make sure we're not an easy target, but a prepared and vigilant community. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to Robert Graves, Zach Williams, and Chris Usher. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zach Williams, and as Michael said, I'm the Deputy Director of Community-Wide Security in the Atlanta region. This is just a quick overview of the topics that we plan to cover today, and we can go ahead and move forward, Dina. For anybody that has not joined us previously on some of our webinars or is new to this, what is the Nonprofit Security Grant Program? In short, it is funding, as Michael said, that is available to provide physical security upgrades and target hardening for your facilities. It's broken down into 2 sections, which we'll discuss later on in the program. Next slide. So for example, one of those programs that is available for funding is the NSGPU versus the NSGPS. The difference there, as you can see highlighted with the state of Georgia, is the Urban Area Security Initiative as opposed to those areas that reside outside of the Urban Area Security Initiative. So for Georgia, for example, the counties that comprise the UASI are available to apply for funding under the NSGPU versus every other county and organizations outside of that for the state are eligible for funding under the NSGPS. That's important to note as we move forward in discussing the investment justification, because it'll enable you to specify which funding stream you're applying for. For instance, the NSGPU, which is comprised of all of the urban areas across the nation, is a separate stream of funding and a separate pot of money than what is allocated to the NSGPS, those that are outside. Oftentimes it's thought of that if you are in the outside of those urban areas, you will be competing against some of the urban areas for the funding. And in reality, if you are outside of the urban area, you maybe have a better shot at some of the funding because you're not competing with the population dense and organization rich environments that comprise an urban area. Next slide. So really what is needed to apply for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, while the application process and the actual submitting of the applications is separate for each state in accordance with your state administrative agency's guidelines, the 3 basic tenets remain the same, and that is having some sort of vulnerability or risk assessment, having your investment justification, and then having a mission statement that specifically covers the impact in your preparedness goals and specifically states the type of organization that you are which is needed kind of as we look at the grading process, and we'll cover that in a second. First, to discuss the vulnerability risk assessment is my colleague, Robert Graves.
Thanks, Zach. As Michael said, I'm Robert Graves. I'm the Regional Security Advisor from SCN for the National Capital Region, where I work in cooperation with the Federation of Greater Washington. As Zach said, each application for the NSGP must include a vulnerability risk assessment as part of the request. This is a core component and what drives the overall evaluation process of the investment justification. Your assessment should be conducted by a security professional when possible. Examples of these include the SCN Regional Security Advisors and Community Security Directors, local Federation Security Directors where there is not an SCN presence. These are free of charge to your community resources. DHS has protective security advisors in each of its regions, small teams, but nonetheless, they are a resource very much like the SCN or local Federation Security Director. They can provide these services. A note to keep in mind, though, is the demand for their services are by the whole community at large. So you will be competing with the larger community for their time to get an assessment conducted. Your local law enforcement agencies can also conduct these assessments, usually through their crime prevention, community service, or community outreach programs. These are also a very good local, should be no cost resource for you to get an assessment done. But again, the community at large will be using this resource, so plan accordingly. Another choice is to contract with the private security consultant. These are often for-profit consultants that can provide these services, so you'll need to budget accordingly for these services if you go with the private security consultant. That is an expense you will not, however, be able to recoup through the NSGP itself if you are successful in receiving the grant. Self-assessments can also be used. There's some variance between state administrative authorities, so can coordinate closely with your state administrative authority to find out if a self-assessment will be accepted. SCN has developed a tool, as Mr. Masters mentioned earlier, that you can use to produce an assessment suitable for your NSGP application. Each assessment should include a description of the facility that will describe its size, its complexity, its nature, place it in context in terms of its location and key functions and essential services it provides to the community. We'll provide the date of the assessment so we know that it's current, a description of the threat landscape. What are the threats to the particular organization as may be identified by its location, its identity, in this case, in our case, a Jewish institution, or some other function such as a house of faith. The assessment should also list vulnerabilities, observations, or findings from the assessor. These will be a key component of the risk portion of the IJ, which we will discuss in a few moments. And lastly, there should be recommendations for mitigating those vulnerabilities based on security best practices. These will help you identify the courses of action that you will attempt to fund through the NSGP application and grant process. Next slide, please. As I said, the vulnerability assessment should help you complete three key parts of your investment justification: the threat, vulnerabilities, and target hardening sections, which we'll discuss shortly. When you receive your report from whomever is producing it, ensure that you have the information you need to complete those portions of the IJ. Once you submit the vulnerability risk assessment with your IJ, it'll be retained by the state administrative authority and is subject to review by DHS FEMA. Normally, it's only when there's some more detailed question for ranking or scoring would DHS FEMA come back to the SAA to look at the assessment, but it is retained on file. And as we said, is a key component of the IJ itself. Failure to submit a vulnerability risk assessment will result in your application being forfeited. It will go no farther at that point if you do not include a current vulnerability and risk assessment. If the facility has the same vulnerabilities and no significant renovations or changes to its operations, you can resubmit the same vulnerability assessment used the year prior. A good rule of thumb is anytime your assessment is more than 2 years old, please get it updated with a new assessment. If in that intervening 2 years, as we said, you changed something about your operations, you've made improvements, you've implemented improvements from a previous grant, you'll want to update that assessment with the fresh assessment going forward. Next slide, please. The NSGP allowable costs are focused primarily on target hardening activities and some other physical security enhancements such as planning and exercises. The funding can be used for the acquisition of the security equipment on both real property and property that's leased. Many of our institutions, many of our organizations borrow or lease property from another institution, and it's possible to get those improvements made on the leaseholders, or excuse me, the landlord's property, as long as it's done in coordination with that landlord. But specifically when we're talking about the prevention and or protection against the risk of a terrorist attack. The equipment that you procure and install is limited to 2 categories on the authorized equipment list. Category 14 is physical security enhancement equipment, and category 15, inspection and screening systems. It's critical that the items you ask for funding for your grant are anchored to this list. You can pull them from those categories. There is a larger AEL. Do not be do not focus on the other categories. Keep your attention on categories 14 and 15. The AEL can be found on the FEMA website for authorized equipment list, and that link will be in the materials you'll receive after this webinar. Next slide, please, and we'll turn it back over to Zach.
Thanks, Robert. So as Robert said, what else can funding be used for? Additional cost with that can be security or security-related functions, whether that's police officers, security guards, guarding contracts. You can also use funding for training or train the trainer type courses, stop the bleed, active shooter, or workshops, whether that's putting together an emergency operation plan, crisis management leadership team, or various plans associated with emergency response. It's highlighted on there twice. It's key and it's vital that you demonstrate that capability on your own and clearly within your investment justification to the state administrative agency and FEMA. Also, something to keep in mind is that although funding can be used for these things, this is to add on and not as a cost alleviating measure. So for instance, if you currently have 2 police officers at your facility and you want to upgrade that to 4, the funding can only be used to fund those 2 additional police officers, not to fund all 4 of them. And the inclusion or the, I guess, ramping up of the 2 new police officers needs to be clearly identified and articulated in your investment justification, as well as how you plan to fund these resources moving forward. Next slide. When you go through the website, as Robert said and showed on the previous slide, the approved equipment list, the easiest way to do it is to click on the box, type in NSGP and hit apply. Categories 14 and 15 are the only 2 categories that are eligible under the nonprofit security grant, but not every item in category 14 or 15 is eligible for funding for nonprofits. So the best way to make sure that you are looking at the correct list is just to go to the website and do a quick search and filter it through there. Next slide. We'll discuss the investment justification a little bit in the next couple of slides in a lot more detail. But 2 things to point out when it comes to the approved equipment list and how that integrates into the investment justification. If you'll look at section 4 under target hardening, this section specifically doesn't say that you need to list your AEL numbers as it covers the scope of the project. However, I think it's good to list that in there. One, it demonstrates to the person grading your investment justification and evaluating it that you have a clear understanding of what you're applying for, that you've actually referenced the approved equipment list, and that you know that those categories line up with your vulnerabilities and your target hardening measures, as well as it goes to kind of marry up those with your core capabilities that are listed later on in the investment justification. Next slide. This is specifically where the AEL numbers have to be listed on your IJ. So it's just as simple as finding those areas that you want to apply for from your vulnerability assessment, finding the corresponding number on your approved equipment list, and then putting that into the AEL section here on the investment justification. Next slide. These are some of the most commonly targeted areas on the approved equipment list, whether that's cameras, fencing, bollards, access control, window film, vehicle gates or alarm. So just one thing to note with that is when you go to the approved equipment list, you can actually click on those different areas and you'll see a description underneath that says exactly what that equipment item is used for or what the purpose of it is. So make sure that you're either one, selecting the most appropriate one that fits with whatever the scope of your project is, or that you've tailored what you are inputting to meet these areas. Something else to consider as you move forward and as we talk about the rest of the investment justification is that those areas specifically don't necessarily cover all of the work that needs to be done with it. For instance, the fencing and the bollards is exactly what it says. Fencing, bollards, jersey barriers, things that would halt to prevent pedestrian traffic or vehicle traffic. Not necessarily all of the groundwork that needs to be done, the clearing of trees, the removal of debris or obstacles in preparation of that fence being installed. So as we go through the rest of the investment justification portion, remember that those numbers on the AEL cover specifically what the AEL says, not some of the outside project and scope with it. Next slide. So with you have your vulnerability assessment, and then you're going to have your mission statement, which we'll talk about towards the end, but your investment justification. And this is really what gets evaluated by the state administrative agency and then gets evaluated by FEMA DHS as it goes up. This needs to have an identified risk, including a threat and vulnerability, and then you're demonstrating to the federal government of why they should invest with you, what the return of investment is going to be, and how specifically does that marry up to your vulnerabilities in terms of building and sustaining on some of the core capabilities and prevention. It needs to be both feasible and effective, and it needs to be completed. You have 3 years from the life of the grant, but really the focus and the priority is given to those that are being completed within a less than 3 years scope. And that's mainly because as you look at some of your vulnerabilities, if it takes 3 years to address some of your vulnerabilities, maybe somewhere else, you can get a quicker return on investment. Shy away from putting multi-year projects and multi-stages, decade-long things into this investment justification, strictly because there's no guarantee that you're going to get funding in the following years. So if this is part of ongoing efforts, and that's every subsequent application would be critical to completing the project, it's highly unlikely then that yours is going to be ranked towards the top. Next slide. The investment justification consists of 7 parts. It's 40 points total. The first part of that isn't scored, and then the rest of it has varying degree of points associated with it. Notice the 2 biggest parts, and those are the ones specifically that Robert and I will discuss here in a second, is the risk is worth 12 points, and then your target hardening, which is worth the 14 points. If you've maxed out both of those, then we can kind of start to talk later on as far as where it could really make or break your application, but definitely the emphasis needs to be placed on identifying a risk and then identifying how that you plan on addressing that risk through the target hardening measures. Next slide. With that, so the first slide here is your applicant information. This isn't graded. This is just going to include your DUNS number, your status as a 503C, and what UOSI you belong to, if you belong to one. Again, so going back to, as we discussed earlier, if you don't belong to a UOSI, that's perfectly fine. You just need to designate on here so you are receiving and competing for the appropriate funding stream. Next slide. So the first one on the investment justification that's graded, and you can see the background, it's only worth 2 points, but it still really kind of helps set you up for the rest of this process, is your background in describing what the symbolic value is, and then have you had any previous role responding to a terrorist attack, either within your organization, a one that occurred or not. So the first part is a symbolic think, and the question says, why is it symbolic, and why would a terrorist organization or terrorist actors target you specifically? What's the potential and why? So kind of think of it as symbolic, not only to the community, but maybe to, kind of the overall at large. So maybe you are a Jewish preschool that's only able to serve that community because of maybe the demographics or whatever. So there's symbolic value associated there. Maybe you have a historic, 200-year-old Torah that survived the Holocaust that's on display. So there's symbolic value that's listed there as well. Maybe you're the only federation in your state, and therefore you have the sole authority and as kind of a community gather and philanthropy efforts. And it's symbolic. If that were to go away, then who's going to fill that void within the community? You may even go as far as including some of the most recent stuff with COVID-19 and how that's impacted your facility. Maybe you're the only shul capable of providing some online Shabbat services, and if that were to go away or to be degraded through a terrorist attack, now it's symbolic because it's going to impact the rest of the community, as nobody else would have access to those. The second part under there is a previous or existing role to responding to a terrorist attack. Think back. Did your executive leadership team, did you get together after Poway? Did you convene a meeting after Pittsburgh to discuss what would happen and what you would do in the circumstances? If so, then you have a previous role responding to a terrorist attack. You have thought through, you have convened your organization's emergency management or emergency planning section, and you've kind of thought through some of that. So list that there. Another thing to consider is an all hazards approach. Again, looking at return on investment. So maybe you have 200 cots that are available, and you could house members of the community if they were displaced during a natural disaster or during a terrorist attack. You have a kitchen that could feed 100 families if needed, or you have a massive parking lot that could be used as a staging area. Those are all additional things that you can consider or that you can input into your application that shows that not only you need the funding to address vulnerabilities, but you need the funding to protect your facilities so you can continue offering these capabilities to the rest of the community. Next slide. And with that, I'll let Robert talk about the risk.
Thanks, Zach. As Zach pointed out, the risk section is one of the most heavily weighted parts of the investment justification, and we want to dive into it with some detail, put a good deal of effort into preparing this section. Most of this information, if not all of it, should come out of your security risk assessment, your risk and vulnerability assessment that we're speaking of earlier. In this section, the first section is threat. That's where that threat landscape description in the risk assessment can be pulled into. You can use a variety of resources here as well. You want to describe the risk in a series, let's think of it as a series of circles working out from your own entity. Are there specific threats or a history of actions against your organization? You'll want to detail those, discuss those. Are there recent events within, say, the last 2 to 3 years within your neighborhood that would have an impact on your facility, your synagogue or day school or JCC? Perhaps there's been no attack or incident against your facility, but one down the street or a few blocks over has experienced some crime, terrorism, or anti-Semitic acts in the last few months or the last 2 to 3 years, as we say. You'll want to identify those. And then you'll want to broaden that out, looking next at your city, your county, your state or region at large, to describe, again, those kinds of impacts. For example, here in the National Capital Region, we'll look at what happens not just, say, in Rockville, Maryland, but in our risk, in the threat portion, we'll look at risk activities that have occurred in Southern Maryland, nearby counties, as well as in the District of Columbia and in Northern Virginia. Those have a potential impact on our organization in Rockville, Maryland. So we'll make sure we address those in the threat portion of this. Resources beyond what may be in your risk and vulnerability assessment, ADL's heat map and its annual audit report will provide some good information broken down by region and type of incident. Those could also have an impact if they've not already been identified in your in your risk and vulnerability assessment. Local police crime reports, crime statistics, again, those can be useful in describing the risk to your organization. If we could go back one slide, please. The second part is the vulnerabilities. That's where we describe the findings from the security or the risk assessment, the risk and vulnerability assessment, as we described earlier. These are the actual findings of whomever conducted the assessment, the actual vulnerabilities to these threats that have been described. You'll want to detail those here. In this section, we want to make sure that the vulnerabilities we list meet two criteria. One, we can directly link them to vulnerabilities in the risk and vulnerability assessment that's a supporting document to the IGA, and also their vulnerabilities we're prioritizing for funding from this grant if it's awarded. Not all vulnerabilities that may be identified in your vulnerability assessment meet the criteria for funding under NSGP, so we want to prioritize and make sure that the ones we list here are those that we can get funding for NSGP for. Next slide, please. And again, in threats, as we talked a few moments ago, think about the who parts of it, think local, but also think of those circles moving out from your organization. Yes, an anti-Semitic attack in El Paso, Texas may have an impact on your organization, but be able to describe how that relates. As we said, the crime statistics, police reports, your risk assessment, and the ADL heat map, other organizations like that provide a wide variety of information. So coordinate with your local federation or ADL office may also be able to provide you additional threat information if you're having trouble compiling information. And as we said, we want to try to limit to the last 24 to 36 months, especially reporting the surrounding area. After a while, the information becomes stale and does not add particular weight to your threat assessment portion of the IJ. If there is an incident that impacted your organization specifically, it may be relevant for many more years past this. You'll need to weigh that and keep that in consideration. Next slide, please. Again, with the vulnerabilities, how does this finding observation from the risk assessment expose your organization, your facility to an act of terrorism? Describe as best you can how you're exposed, what the risk or the nature of the destruction or incapacitation might be. Again, tied back to the specific funding you're requesting, and list those that you intend to use with the grant. But please do not list items that are not directly supported by your risk and vulnerability assessment. If there's something that comes to light while you're drafting that's not the risk and vulnerability assessment, and you feel it's strongly enough, it's something to be included, you may need to go back to the assessor and ask them to revisit the assessment and update your assessment. Next slide, please. Potential consequences. This is where your expertise, knowing your organization and the history and role of the organization, the community are critical. What Zach was talking about before. It becomes how everything comes together, and think broadly about this. In addition to loss of life, there may be ongoing impacts to the organization of an attack. But also consider those second and third order effects. If our organization cannot do X, what else doesn't happen in the community? Where's the shortfall in the community? Where's the community deprived of an essential or critical service or function? As you think about the consequences, think about severe outcomes, but make sure they're plausible outcomes. Not everything we can imagine is truly a plausible outcome. There's a certain element of probability assessment in this process. Severe but plausible outcomes are what we want to describe. And some examples of those may be the loss of cultural artifacts, financial hardship on employees, or a loss of facilities that you provide, services you provide to the county or the community at large. And don't forget on how to list how it will impact your ability to respond to a terror attack as described earlier. Next slide, please. With this, I would turn it back to Zach.
Thanks, Robert. So as Robert said, so we've gone through our vulnerability assessment, and we've kind of looked and identified what our threat is, the potential consequences, and exactly what our vulnerabilities are. So now it's time to kind of take all of this and kind of piece it together. This is specifically what you're asking for funding to address. So this is taking the portions from your vulnerability assessment, taking the portions from the previous sections on the investment justification, your vulnerabilities, and then talking through how you plan on addressing those. So target hardening must address the vulnerabilities previously listed, and it needs to kind of incorporate all of it, whether that's the infrastructure kind of surrounding it, or and including the policy and procedure and kind of the other stuff that may accompany it based on whatever it is that you're implementing. Again, this is a great section to use the AEL number in the top part when you're writing your narrative, but definitely it's needed as you do it on the bottom part of this, is specifically what you're asking for. Next slide. Your milestones, this should be done in a thoughtful and purposeful way, is how you plan on implementing this project, and exactly what it is you expect to achieve as you move through the life of the grant. Should be logical, and it kind of needs to be chronological. Be realistic. We're not going to put the roof on our house before we've even poured or laid a foundation. So it needs to follow some sort of chronological flow as you go through this, and just be realistic on your time frames, understanding that you're not going to be made aware whether you even got the grant until probably 1st of October, right at the end of September. A lot of times there's MOUs that have to be completed. There's the environmental historical preservation that needs to be done after you've been awarded. That could take up to at least 90 days to be reviewed before you even have a letter certifying that you're clear to begin spending the project, time you get the bids and everything else. So there's a lot that goes into it. So please don't just list that you're going to be done by October of the next year, or that you'll be done by New Year's. It needs to be a very thoughtful approach on how you're going to manage these milestones. Next slide. With that, and the project management piece is exactly who's going to manage the project and what qualifications do they have in doing so. What makes them qualified in handling this project? This is a good point to kind of tie in some of those other areas that you've kind of previously talked about. Maybe it's going to be your facilities manager who's been there for 20 years and they have an intimate knowledge of the vulnerabilities, and then a chance for you to kind of list them again. So just be, again, thoughtful of who's going to manage the project and who's going to be overseeing this as it's being implemented. Next slide. The last part of it, the IJ, is the impact section. And this looks at your 5 core capabilities that are identified by DHS and FEMA, and how are you as an organization, if awarded funding, supporting these areas, or either building or sustaining or improving upon. So it needs to clearly identify how you plan on doing that through your project. There's a reference there at the bottom, and it'll be available also with the rest of this as this is sent out. Click through there, and it'll kind of tell you exactly what each one of those areas mean. Next slide. So for instance, the preparedness goal, it says right there, is to prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and to recover. Give a short statement on how you plan on doing that. For example, at the bottom, you're going to address protection. It's a physical protective measure, and the installation of the glass will reduce the vulnerability for up to 20 minutes. If you can quantify things, that's even better. So exactly how is it that your portion of the grant, is it going to enhance these areas? But also think broadly. So maybe you don't necessarily, as your investment specifically, maybe it's not going to address mitigation. Maybe what you're asking for is to prevent or protect. But if you're a federation, for instance, you kind of have more of a communal role. If you have a JCC, again, you have a communal role. So you have the ability as a communal role to impact some of these other areas for other organizations. You can help with the mitigation process because you're able to help draft plans, host workshops, different things like that. So by the very nature of you existing within the community as this communal role organizer, you automatically have these other areas kind of as part of your purview, and something happening to your facility would impact all of those other areas beyond immediately the protective prevention. Next slide. This is part of the investment justification on the first page, where it talks about your background, and it says that you need a DUNS number and SAM registration. This kind of goes back and forth, and I get a lot of questions of this from other organizations. Do we need it? Do we not need it? You will need a DUNS number, and it's free to register. If you need to look yours up, that's also free to do a search and to find out if you have one. Just follow the link there, type in your organization's information, and then copy that number and make sure it's on the first page of your investment justification. A SAM registration or SAM requirement, that is dependent upon each state's administrative agency. So while there's no prerequisite from FEMA for you to have a SAM registration, your state may require it. So that's something you just need to double check with your state administrative agency if that's something that they require. Next slide. So we've gone through our threat assessment, our vulnerability assessment. We've married that up now with our investment justification. Now we're looking at the last thing that's really needed to apply for the grant from the federal level, and that's a mission statement. Mission statement clearly is stating what it is your organization does. It can be as simple as taking your mission statement and putting it on a Word document with letterhead and saving that. Or it can be a lot more formal. If you have any questions as exactly how it needs to look, just double check with your state administrative agency. The biggest thing and the biggest takeaway from your mission statement is that you need to clearly define that you're an ideologically based spiritual religious institution. This is going to play a huge portion as we get into the grading process and exactly how many points are awarded for your organization based on that. So even if you are a Jewish day school, you don't focus on the education, you need to focus on that you are a Jewish day school. So focus on the Jewish nexus versus maybe the education piece. Next slide. And it's exactly for this reason. So again, the IJ is out of 40 points, and each section has different points associated with it, as we saw. In years past, the state administrative agency goes through and scores all of those. They send those to FEMA. FEMA has an individual look at them and they grade it. They give it to somebody else and they grade it. They average those scores together along with timesing it by a formula that's made up. The most points are awarded for those that are religiously based institutions. That's why we say make sure you specifically highlight that in your mission statement so you can make sure that you're receiving the most amount of points. I've seen it happen on the other side where organizations are a Jewish day school and they emphasize the fact that they are a school and not so much their Jewish nexus, and they've lost the points that they could have had as an organization and with their application. 5 bonus points are awarded for those that have never been awarded. So again, specifically those that are outside of an urban area. This is a great thing to focus in on because historically those outside of an urban area have not been allowed to apply. So they would automatically probably qualify for this. So if you think that should we apply, should we not apply, is this worth it, and you've never applied, know that FEMA understands this and is trying to give you a little bit of an incentive, and so to collectively raise the posture of the community versus continuously awarding those that receive it every year. Next slide. This is some common areas where points are lost based off what I've seen in the past and historically, and it's on that first section. So with the background is not clearly identifying or defining what your symbolic value is, and not identifying what role that you have had previously in responding to a terrorist attack. So again, think of it in an all hazards approach. What does your facility have? How can you not only impact your organization and your immediate, congregants or staff or students, but how can you affect the broader community? Do you have that gym that can house 200 cots? Do you have that kitchen that can cook so many meals? And then how does that play into your emergency operation plan? Next slide. Another area is on the risk section, and it's a little bit of confusion of what is a vulnerability, what is a threat, and kind of how does that then feed into our consequences. So just remember, your threat is who is conducting the attack. You know, if you lack a fence or access control, that is your vulnerability, and your threat, taking advantage of the fact that you have no fence and you have no access control and therefore is able to carry out an attack, that is the ultimate consequences. So it needs to flow somewhat in that order. They should all be nestled within one another, which then really helps as it translates to the target hardening section. Just don't forget, there it says at the bottom, if you identified areas that you are existing or previously have helped others in responding to a terrorist attack, don't forget to include that section here as well for potential impacts. If you said we had a kitchen and we can feed 100 people and something happens at your organization, it's perfectly fine to outline the rest of it, but don't forget you're also losing that capability now to feed those 100 people. So make sure that you've incorporated all of that and that all of these are kind of nestled within one another. Next slide. And then the other section really that points are taken off of it is here, and the last one is impact. And target hardening, really the most points are taken off is just because applicants are failing to marry up their vulnerabilities to what they're asking for on the investment justification. You had a vulnerability assessment that said that you lacked perimeter fencing and you needed access control, and the applicant applies for cameras and security guards. And so maybe it doesn't always match up. And so it's left with the evaluator or the grader looking at it and trying to determine why it is exactly you're applying for one thing when you've outlined previously in the application completely different vulnerabilities. So make sure that your vulnerabilities are explicitly stated and marry up exactly to what you're asking for in your target hardening section. Next slide. Some useful resources is the state administrative agencies. So it's something to note is that administrative agencies, they have the ability to set the deadlines when it comes to receiving back the investment justifications. FEMA will release the notice of funding and they'll say that they're due back to the federal government on X date and 30 days from now. But the state administrative agency has the ability to say, we want it back due in 15 days to give ourselves 15 days to buffer. So that changes state by state. So just make sure that you're aware of the deadlines and what exactly it is that your state administrative agency requires of you for applying. Are you just sending an Excel spreadsheet with all of these attachments in an email, or are you using some sort of online portal that has you submitting different things? It has various other documents that need to be included before you can have access to those things. The last thing that you would want is for the due date to be rapidly approaching, and you have to have several different memorandums and different documents signed and dated and submitted online before you're even granted access to a portal to submit an application. So just make sure that you've verified with what your state administrative agency specifically wants. Next slide. Some other useful resources. There's just through FEMA, through either the NSGP website, reading through what the national preparedness goals are, and kind of developing what your core capabilities are through that. Again, those all should marry up. And if you're looking at your investment justification from the first paragraph all the way down to the last sentence, it should flow as a narrative. It should flow almost as you're telling a story. And explicitly stating why then that you need the funding. Next slide.
All right, thank you so much to our experts. Now that we have concluded the the presentation for today, want to go into Q&A. We've gotten a lot of questions over the course of the conversation, so we'll attempt to get through as many as possible in the time we have, and then of course follow up as stated at the outset with this recording and with the resources that were covered throughout. So I'll open it up just with, there's been some recurring questions related to multi-tenant facilities and what the recommended sort of approach is for an organization that's interested in applying, that perhaps has multiple organizations housed in the same place, whether they're affiliated or not. And if we could turn it to our team here to address that.
Dina,
Happy
we've
to
had,
address. Go ahead, Rob.
okay, we've had some success in the National Capital Region with those multi-tenant organizations, with the main organization applying for the grant, and the weight of all the other faith-based or other nonprofit organizations within that facility adds to the scoring.
Great. Thanks, Robert. In addition, if an organization, for instance, has its own building and then operates a different facility in a different location, would you apply the same sort of logic to that, or is there a specific recommendation on that?
I think that currently, if an organization has facilities in different states, right? Say one facility in New York and one facility in New Jersey, it is perfectly reasonable for them to apply separately and individually in each of those states. When you're talking about a situation where an organization has multiple locations within the same state, I would say that it has been my experience that they can apply for multiple locations, but are limited to the cap that is set forth by that state. So if there's $100,000 for an organization, they may be able to split that $100,000 across 2 or more locations. With that said, I know that FEMA is considering a change in the guidance for FY 2021 that may allow an organization that has 2 or more locations within the same state to apply individually for each of those locations, who would then benefit from each having the ability to spend up to that cap, whatever the cap is set forth. That is something that we will only know about once the notice of funding opportunity is published.
As a reminder, Rob, can you let everyone know when we anticipate that notice of funding opportunity being made available?
Sure. My expectations as of this morning, which could be updated tomorrow, is that the NOFO will be released on or about the last week of February. And typically FEMA will release the NOFO on the Friday of whichever week that they are releasing it. And as soon as we know, if we get any intelligence that we have a more specific date, we will certainly push that out to the field.
Excellent. A few questions have come in on collaborative applications and if that is allowed or recommended.
Again, I think Robert Graves alluded to it. If there needs to be one applicant with one DUNS number and one typically location. If there are multiple organizations that are within the same location or contiguous in some way or share a campus with a defined perimeter, then you will see applications that may benefit multiple entities. But there has to be one lead organization. If there's a circumstance where there are different organizations that are somehow housed in the same location, there may be reason for each to apply separately. So if there's, for example, a synagogue and next to it is a day school, they may have some level of affiliation, but they may be operating under separate, i.e., employment identification numbers, and they consider themselves as separate entities, it's a consideration that they may want to apply separately and in their own right, and that way possibly benefiting from a greater amount of funding if they both are successfully awarded grants.
Thank you. Gotten a couple questions on allowability for cybersecurity related efforts. Can you speak to that, perhaps Zach or Robert?
Yeah, so currently the approved equipment list only covers some of those areas for physical target hardening or the screening of whether that's x-ray machines or screening mail packages, things along those lines. You can, to an extent, incorporate some aspects of cyber as it pertains to implementing cameras or access control if those areas are needed and necessary for the overall installation. But as far as a complete cyber audit or rebuilding a just plain cyber infrastructure and network, those costs currently aren't allowed by the approved equipment list.
I would just add that there may be some equipment to back up files and things related to software. I would remind that the priority of this program is physical target hardening to save lives and protect property. And while there is one category within the AEL that does touch upon cyber, it's not necessarily, hasn't been historically considered a priority for funding under this program. So I would just argue that if it is something that comes up in your risk assessment, it would have to be described as a top or most significant priority. And therefore, that is why it is being addressed through the application. We have asked FEMA to clarify within the next NOFO on the issue of cyber, because sometimes they reflect on it in the NOFO, even though they're on the scoring and consideration side, they may not think of it as a top priority. So hopefully the NOFO will provide some specific cyber guidance as well.
Great, we're running up on the hour, and so we'll just answer one last question that I'll pose to the team. Several questions have come in related to prior applications and requests for feedback or information as to why an application might not be successful, and if there are ways that applicants can improve their applications for this year and future. So in addition to attending these webinars, any recommendations from the team?
Well, it's funny, this question came to me today, and Zach may actually be able to answer this, because the example that came in is when an executive director of a yeshiva who is now in Baltimore but formerly was in Atlanta and applied for an entity in Atlanta, the state administrative agency in Atlanta did furnish feedback to sub-applicants who had requested it, such as, the scoring worksheet that the SAA had completed and where they may have lost points. I would say that most SAAs do not provide that level of feedback. There are issues about logistics and bandwidth and privacy, which prevents them as a policy from providing that feedback. FEMA and their level of review will never provide that feedback for many reasons. But what I tend to tell folks is that the outcomes are based on a multiplicity of factors, some of which, including the scoring at the state level, but there are many reviewers in the process, as Zach mentioned. At the federal level, there are multiple reviewers, and they they average the scoring. But there's also issues about how each state is viewed in terms of their level of risk in any particular year, and other factors that go into a final judgment. In the end, it's up to the discretion of the Secretary of Homeland Security for final awards. So it's very hard to pinpoint why in one year an applicant may have received an award but didn't another year, or why a neighbor received an award but we didn't. So long story short, You can always ask your SAA after the fact. The chances are that you'll probably not get the feedback that you're seeking by going that way. And the best thing you can do is work with folks at SCN and JFNA, the state security directors, the regional security directors, and continue to work with us to make sure that you're just doing the best that you can in any given year. And certainly if you didn't secure a request in one year, we would encourage you to reapply, because another key factor is there's only so much funding available. So when those resources dry up, there are those that have very good applications, but the resources just were no longer available. So they shut down, the process.
Yeah, I would echo that. I've seen applications that were complete 40 out of 40 and were not awarded. And I've seen applications that were a 28 out of 40 and they received funding. So a lot of it just depends on, as Rob said, kind of who's reviewing it, what the national and strategic priorities are at that given moment. But yeah, definitely coordinate with your state administrative agency and make an effort to get that coordination and those workshops off the ground and those relationships off the ground outside of grant season. It's probably a lot more likely that you're going to get that one-on-one feedback with somebody from the state administrative agency, or collectively that feedback from the state administrative agency, if you're doing this process and asking these questions from them in March and April and July versus the month or so before the application becomes available.
I can jump in one quick second. One, we appreciate everybody being on the call. One of the things that on the Zoom, and I want to really thank Zach and Robert and Rob. One of the things that we're going to ask everyone as we move through this is those that attended, we're going to be reaching out to ask if you intend to submit an application, and then if you have submitted an application and the outcome of that. It's really important for our data metricing. As we talk to DHS and FEMA, and as Rob does some of the great work that he does on Capitol Hill, and we work to have a more coordinated strategy as a community, that we're able to provide feedback to the appropriators and DHS and FEMA. So for those that are willing to share that information, we'll be very, very grateful. It'll all be anonymous, but we will be getting in touch and ask you to stay in touch with us on that process and that feedback. So back to you, Dina. Sorry.
Thank you. And I echo the appreciation for our team here, for Rob, Robert, Zach, and Michael, to JFNA, our great partners, as well as at the Conference of Presidents, for helping us put these webinars on and sharing the knowledge with all of you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Again, we will circulate this recording and resources for today's conversation, as well as last week's overview webinar. All of it will be available on SCN's website, securecommunitynetwork.org, and we will be available for questions. You can always reach out to the SCN duty desk at securecommunitynetwork.org. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.